You're one of over 100 people who are joining us this week for our virtual sessions, with over 100 also due next week at our various in-person gatherings. We're really excited to see many of you next week, and you'll be hearing more about those sessions in a teaser clip later on this morning. But we're also very excited to see so many of you on Zoom. I think after 18 months of staring at screens, it takes something to get people to happily sign up for virtual sessions. And I think it speaks to the quality of the fantastic panel we're going to be hearing from today, that you've given up your mornings to be part of this conference. You're funders from across sectors, you're public organisations, private, philanthropic, and together you're part of our network of nearly 180 organisations, giving out over £500 million a year across London's communities. We know you want to do it well, which is why you're here, and what we hope to help with over the next 90 minutes and through our sessions across this conference fortnight. Before we get into the conversation with the panel, there's a few bits to let you know about how today is going to work so that you can get the most from it. You're obviously joining us in webinar format. That means you can see us, but sadly we can't see you and you can't see each other. So there's a few functions along the bottom of the screen that we'd encourage you to use. There's the chat box, so do use that if you want to say hello to people, you want to share resources, you want to agree or disagree passionately with our panel. That's the space for conversation, and we'll be sure to share highlights in terms of resources and links with people afterwards. There's also a question box, a Q&A box at the bottom there. So if you've got a question you want to ask our panel, that's the place to put it. It will be a bit difficult for us at times to keep an eye on the chat, so we'll be focusing on the Q&A box for any questions that you want to ask. So please make sure you're putting it in there. You can also in that box see the questions that other people have asked, and if there's one you're particularly keen to see us answer, then you can give it the thumbs up just to move it up that list on the screen to make sure we spot it. If you're on social media, if you're on Twitter, we'd really encourage you to share your thoughts, your reflections on the discussion so that we can engage more people in the debate about the future of funding. Just use our hashtag conference21. That's conference as in camera, not conference. It's another of our incredibly witty event names that we have here at London Funders. So thank you in advance for tweeting that and trying to make sure other people are aware of the discussions we're having today. In terms of timings, we're with you through to about 11:25 today, so we're hoping to give you a few minutes time before your inevitable 11:30 sessions to grab a cup of tea and take a quick breather before your 11:30s. But fantastic to have you with us for the next 90 minutes. I think that's all you need to know to be able to engage with today's session. This is the first of 3 sessions that we're having this week, and this one is focused on power and participation. We've got lots of questions to explore this morning. We're thinking about power, who holds it, how do we shift it? Those have been key themes that I think funders have been grappling with over the last year. We've also been grappling with how we tackle inequity in funding processes, how we ensure that investment into marginalised communities is sustained in the long term, and what changes we might need to make in our governance or traditional funding models to make them more equitable. So we're going to be exploring some of those themes, some of your questions with our panel of expert speakers. So I'm really pleased to be joined on screen by that brilliant panel. We have Akela, who's the director and founder of Sister System. We have Manny, who's the chief executive of Trust for London. We have Natasha, who's the director of Camden Giving. And we have Yvonne, who's the founder and CEO of Ubailey. So I'm going to be getting the conversation going with some opening questions, but please do remember to put your own questions in the Q&A box, and we'll be coming to them soon. So we're going to start with some reflections from the last year. And Yvonne, I might come to you first with this one, if I may, and then Manny and Natasha, I'll bring you in as well. And the question's asking to sort of think back over the last 18 months, which has obviously brought into sharp relief that funders need to do more to address the inherent inequity and power dynamics in the funding sector. Our question is, what lessons and reflections have you made following this year? Yvonne, can I start with you?
Sure. Thank you, James, and thank you again for inviting me to this conference. I'm learning new lexicon here. It doesn't really roll off the tongue very easily, but thank you. So, you know, it's really interesting because Ubailey has found itself in a very strange position. We are community focused. We're based in communities as well as working regionally and nationally and internationally. And also we've found ourselves in the space collaborating with funders to design and develop funding responses, particularly in the light of the pandemic. Prior to late 2019, we had no experience whatsoever in this field. So we've had to learn really fast. And that's because funders didn't want to fund us. We only had £10,000 from a Walls Fall, as I keep repeating, just to sort of kind of bring home a message about the dire state of disinvestment in Black and minoritized communities prior to the last 18 months. Reflections. You know, I was thinking this morning about this, and I thought of the sort of adage about every journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step. I think that we've made a single step. It might be a baby step, I think, because when you start on any journey, you're not sure where it's going to take you. You're not sure how long it's going to take you to get there. You're not sure about the terrain or the territory. And I think it's very much been like that. And those of us who've been involved in the field, working with community organisations and across the system for many, many decades, and I've been involved in this work for 40 years plus. It's a moment in time which we pushed for many years and decades, and there've been sort of schisms in the system that, like, there's been this major crack in the system this past 18 months. And as I also say, where there's a crack, there's an opportunity. So it feels like, you know, we've had convergence of a whole raft of cataclysmic world events in the last 18 months. And it seems as though that has opened up an opportunity for dialogue in a way that we've not had it before. I mean, I say I've been involved in anti-racist work since the late 70s, early 80s, well, late 70s, not even early 80s. And although we had some movement and shifts in the system, it felt like it clamped back even more tightly than before. I hope what's happened in the last 18 months in terms of that space for dialogue and to initiate particular kinds of you know, sort of new and much needed and interesting kinds of responses. You know, my reflection on certainly on what's happened, but also on the future, is that we cannot go back to where we were before. In fact, I know that the younger people are not going to allow it. Those of us who are at the other end of our career, we're kind of like, we've seen it, been there, but actually we know the younger voices in the system have come into the system in the last couple of years are not going to allow for us to kind of go back to where we were. I mean, what's been interesting is in some of the funding initiatives that Ubele's been involved in, and we've been privileged to be involved in those funding initiatives. We've been able to get into dialogue with some of the funders who actually rejected us. They weren't interested in our work pre-COVID. And we've had some of those hard conversations about what happened back then, number one. So we've been able to actually turn the tide slightly and really be honest. I think also what we've been able to do is to develop initiatives like with through LCRF, all the work that's happened there with our equity crew. James knows all about the work, and some of you on the call also know much about the work, as well as things like the Phoenix Way that's been developed with the lottery, which is a first major investment, 50 million over 5 years, has actually been ring-fenced and being led by Black and minoritized community leaders, because we are the experts. You know, we don't just have lived experience, and I hate that term with a passion because it seems to be quite reductionist. You've got lived experience, we've got something else. We are experts. We know our work, we know our communities, but we've been able to start that process, and that's really exciting, a national process. And also we were able to lead on the development of the Busca papers, which I'll refer to a little bit later. But that was the opportunity to begin to bring to the table the voice of our sector. Because actually, ultimately, that money that's been given to us as funders, we know where the vast majority of that money's come from, and it's been from the blood, sweat and tears of our ancestors. And so we know it's actually our money that's in the hands of other people. And so the Busca table papers were the first opportunity to say, this is what the sector is telling you it needs. Come into dialogue with us, get round the table with us, and then we'll start having an honest conversation about what we need long term.
Fantastic. Thank you, Yvonne. You said it was a privilege to be involved in some of those initiatives. I think having worked with you over the last 18 months on some of those, I'd say the privilege is all ours. I think there's some real power in what you're saying and sharing in terms of how we can think differently. And I know Natalie's posted in the chat the link to the Busca papers as well. So if people haven't seen it, it's also on the London Funders website as well. And we'll make sure that gets tweeted out too. But thank you for setting the scene there with your reflections. Mani, do you mind if I come to you next in terms of how sort of lessons and reflections of the last 18 months have been for you?
Yeah, thanks, James. I mean, the 3 points I'm going to make really are really related to sort of how we work as a foundation. And I think the first and most obvious one is working collaboratively. This crisis has enabled a significant sort of uptick in the amount of collaborative working that foundations across London have been engaged with, and you as London funders have been at sort of the heart of that. It's quicker decision making, it's more compromises in our processes, it's trying to say less of what do we need and like what can we forego in order to make the collective thing work. And I think that's sort of super good. And I was sort of thinking, there's been 3 crises I've been involved in sort of my career that I can think of. One was 10 years ago in the Tottenham riots, the one was Grenfell, and then obviously we've all been involved in the coronavirus crisis. And it's been a similar story in each of those, really. People work more quickly, they kind of put the rules to one side and just kind of get on with what needs to be done. But what doesn't always happen afterwards, particularly with institutions that have sort of rules and ways of doing things, they don't always absorb the ways of working and change how they do things. I remember in Tottenham, the council worked in a really sort of agile way during and after those riots, meeting lots of the needs of the local community, but it was very hard to see that in the way they operated after that crisis went away. And similar accusations could be made to lots of institutions. I think for us, the question is, how can we be more collaborative? How can we, as I say, be less about how we want to operate and trying to kind of compromise on that to make the collaboration more smooth and frictionless. I think there's a huge role for you as London funders there. So your leadership role in bringing foundations together, saying, look, this is how the collective should operate, and let's sort of do things and make compromises is super important. And we didn't get it all right. I think there's lots of examples, I think, during the LCRF, which can be improved upon, the systems, the forms, all that kind of stuff. But I think it's about the mentalities of the foundations going forward. How can we, adopt that kind of attitude moving forward? The second is, again, just reflecting. This is more related to sort of Black Lives Matter type stuff. Is reflecting on where your funding is going. So we've all got the data about where our funding is going. Are we using it, looking at it in a way which brings genuine truth to sort of our decision making? So we did an audit of where our funding goes in relation to race equality, and other funders did it too in a collective, Funders of Race Equality Collective. And actually the results were interesting for me. Like 70% of our funding goes to BME groups as beneficiaries, which is probably what I would have roughly guessed at. But 14% goes to projects led by BME groups, and that was lower than what I think I would have guessed at beforehand. So you can get some real insight by just looking at your data and bringing that to the fore. And the third is slightly related to that kind of finding, really, is, we all talk about humility in grant making, but what genuine humility is really hard to sort of pull off, because no matter how good your relationships are with your grantees or applicants, is they're unlikely to really sort of tell you exactly what they think of your processes and how they're experiencing it, because there is that inherent power dynamic. And sometimes they like you, they don't want to want to focus on sort of the negatives. And we've done 2 things in the last 12 months, which have really brought some very useful, sometimes brutal feedback to us from our grantees, collected anonymously. One was a grantee perception survey, which told us that perhaps in some areas we were lagging behind. And as a sort of follow-on to that, we are engaging in a piece of work to look at how we can redesign our processes around the needs of users. And we've commissioned CAST, a sort of social technology charity, to go and talk to in depth to a group of our applicants and find out what they think. And again, you get insights that you just never get if we were to ask them, even through a survey of our own, which have been, sometimes I say brutal, but it will really help us to redesign the way we do things to make it a much more proportionate experience for grantees that are applying for funding from us. So there's a genuine step back, open yourself up and bring on this feedback, because it's super important, and that's the only way we're really going to be able to respond to what's going on. I'll leave it there.
Fantastic, thank you, Manny. I think there's something really important there about putting the truth into the system, be that through the data or be that through hearing voices of people and how we can make sure that shapes. So I think you can see the benefit of that. Yvonne referenced the equity crew through the LCR, and I think they're working collectively with groups led by and for communities with the voice of that community at the heart meant you can shift the process. I think in the last wave of funding, I think it was about 85% of the funding went to groups led by and for the communities that they were trying to serve. So I think actually when that voice is there, when that data is there, when that intelligence is there, you can bring about that kind of change. But as you say, there's a challenge there around the culture, the mentality, the sort of longevity of some of these changes. I think it's really, really important for us to to explore. So thank you for flagging those as issues. Natasha, can I ask you from your experience at Camden Giving, your lessons, your reflections of the last 18 months?
Yeah, sure. And a lot of them sort of echoing what Yvonne and Manny have said, and this sort of this different relationship of working across sector and collaborating, what a strength that is. I actually think as funders that are on this call, and members of London Funders anyway, should we say, and that's a subset of funders, of course, have been relatively good at talking to each other and collaborating for a while, but collaborating beyond the sector we're in is not something that has come easily. And COVID did bring about a real urgency to collaborate with local government. And for us, while some of the specifics of that have gone, you know, we're not running the same programme with London, with Camden Council, but we've sort of flexed that muscle a little bit. We know what it's like now to work together in partnership, and that seems to be making setting up other things as a partnership with them much easier, but also much easier to hold them to account. So it seems to be much easier for our community panels that we work with to award grants to have their voices heard within Camden Council. And it's not the same as how we were responding to COVID, but we're used to working together more in a different way. And I feel really optimistic that that will be something that will continue onwards. How we work with the private sector, I think, isn't quite so simple. And I don't think that was one of the things that was a real strength of COVID. And I think we need to keep thinking on that. A lot of the good things that came out of the last 18 months are things like trusting of grantees more and trusting of communities. And my personal reflection on that, I'm not sure if it's a Camden Giving reflection, is that COVID touched everyone, although of course not touched everyone equally, but we all had a sense of solidarity that perhaps doesn't always happen. And that meant that we acted with more urgency than we normally do. But what worries me is that surely we as funders knew that a crisis would fall more on vulnerable communities that we support. Surely we knew that. And why did it take getting to crisis point to sort of start putting some of these things into place? And I'm really interested in the Trust for London survey that's gone out, and like, why is it that we weren't holding ourselves to better standards and having a more trust-based approach before this? And actually, if we're going to bounce from crisis to crisis to crisis in the world, why did it take, for us at Camden Giving, why did it take crisis for us to start recording data on Black and Brown funders, Black and Brown leaders that we're funding? We didn't have that data before, and we shouldn't have needed to get to a crisis point to hold it. And it's partly that we're sort of living in our own echo chamber way, way, way too much. People are far too nice to us.
Thanks, Natasha. I think the challenges there are about getting out of some of those echo chambers. I think one of my reflections actually quite early on in the pandemic was I'd spent 20 years on the other side of the fence asking for money, and I promised money, never lying to Trust for London about what I did with it. But genuinely, sorry, this is being recorded, isn't it? But the challenge, actually, even though I've only been in this job a few years, when we did the We Stand With the Sector statement at the start of the pandemic, and we got feedback from groups just saying how revolutionary it was to have funders say to them, we trust you, we want to be flexible, we want to be understanding, shook me a little bit, because I thought we had that relationship, and I thought there was some of that understanding, and I'd slightly forgotten the power dynamic in a way, even just having been on this side for a few years. I think there's something really important there about that relationship. And also the point about crisis, I think, to Manny's point as well about how you learn from previous events. I came into this job just after the Grenfell Tower fire response, and there's a quote in the learning report from IVAR, the possible not the perfect, from one of the funding managers, who says, two women are killed every week by their partner. Why isn't that a crisis? Why have we not adopted some of the similar approaches there? And actually how you bring about some of that thinking into business as usual is a challenge we are going to have to address, and hopefully this conversation can help bring some of that to light. And actually it's a beautiful segue, Akela, to you, if I may, to think about it from an organisation that's applying for funding and navigating some of those relationships from that side. How's the last year, 18 months been for you? Have you seen funders doing things differently? Are they doing more to reach out to diverse communities and organisations? What would your reflections be? Just going to need you to press the unmute button as well. Apologies.
Yeah. Morning, everybody. Thank you, James, and to the rest of the panelists. It's been, on reflection, a really bittersweet 12 to 18 months for Sister System and for me and for the rest of the team. I think the reality is, Sister System was founded because we, as a group of professional Black women who, as Yvonne rightly said, are the experts, acknowledged that there was a crisis way before the crisis of COVID-19 and the pandemic that has brought about. But unfortunately, prior to the pandemic, funders didn't see what we were seeing and didn't trust, which I think, again, is, listening to what Natasha was saying and what you were saying, James, I think that just speaks to how embedded the inequities are that we're having to deal with, that even at that level of leadership, there is still a lack of trust between major funders and micro organizations, and also, and Yvonne and Ubeli is running international, global, kind of initiatives with impact, but yet still can't gain the trust and the respect of funders to be able to do what they do. And certainly Sister System in our first few years had the same experience. Whereas when the pandemic hit, it was all of a sudden boxes appeared on funding applications that just weren't there before. Questions appeared, funders became open to and wanting to understand our models of working and acknowledging the impact that it had, and acknowledging that actually we are the experts, we are on the front line, and that we can manage funds and we can discharge our duties, and that we, also on top of that, have the kind of passion and commitment to really affect social change, because many of the inequities that our beneficiaries are dealing with, we too are dealing with, not just in our lived experience, but in our day-to-day attempts at running our organisations and meeting our charitable objectives. Having said all of that, for Sister System, the last 18 months have been, as I said, bittersweet, and the sweetness has been that we have been awarded enough funding to be able to meet what the incredible amount of need that came through to us, and how rapidly those referrals and the urgency of how the pandemic affected what were already a set of citizens of our community, our society and our country that were absolutely on the fringes, that were not heard, that didn't have a voice. And I think funders kind of recognized, for not just from a place of personal empathy, but also from a professional, why have we got here? How are we in this situation? And then kind of working with us and many other, organizations that work with some of the most disadvantaged members of our communities to say, look, what can we do? So for us, I really found is that, for example, we had funders that had previously turned down applications come back to us and kind of make personal phone calls to myself and, members of our board say, look, can you put in an application? We want to fund you. And with that, I think, comes the conversation around the kind of level of understanding that, is this just because all of a sudden this is now so in everybody's faces that we have to do something about it and it's reactionary? Or is this actually, now is the time to mobilize and to put investment into the places that are, that have been disproportionately impacted because they were already disproportionately disadvantaged. So for us, much like I think Ubelli and many other initiatives, we went from really struggling financially and relying on volunteers and all of the team kind of working, and juggling other things to be able to keep Sister System going, to actually being able to mobilize a team, acknowledge a team's skill and expertise, and reflect that in the contracts that we were then able to offer them. And so, yeah, for us in that way, James, it's been a positive experience. I think that funders, I'm very interested to know what funders and what the landscape is going to look like in the next 12 to 18 months. So all of the conversations that we've had, all of the data that's being collected, all of the new criteria that's sprung up on funding applications, what happens to that now? How is that going to be pulled through to ensure that funders continue to kind of acknowledge their responsibility in this? Because if funders have now invested into these community organisations and acknowledged us as expertise, that means in turn our beneficiaries and our communities are even more reliant on us. They're ever more reliant on us than they were before. They trust us more because we're now able to show them that we can meet need consistently, and we can continue to do that. But in the next 12 to 18 months, I think that part of what I'm really interested to talk about is how do we work with funders for them to continue to kind of take on that responsibility that, okay, if you've started invested in these organizations, that has to now continue, because we now have, Sister System went from, for example, having kind of, 30 to 40 beneficiaries to having over 100 beneficiaries looking to us as their main source of support. We now sit on the majority of statutory panels across Haringey and across Enfield. We're supporting statutory service providers, we're supporting other not-for-profits, and we're really working together in an incredible way that can really begin to allow us to take another step forward, but without that continued building of that relationship of trust and equality at the leadership level, leaders of funds and leaders of organizations. My main concern is that as quickly as we've been able to meet that need, we're going to go downhill, and and the challenge for us as leaders is going to become sustaining our organization, as opposed to looking at our models of working and getting better at what we're already doing incredibly well.
Fantastic, thank you, Ken. I think that's a really important challenge. I think is that you do see changes in the way that people behave, and as you say, some really positive moves and some positive developments and some positive investments and connections that have been made. But that point about sustainability and how you build that change for the longer term, again, some of the themes that colleagues Yvonne, Manny, Natasha echoed as well, in terms of that. The sustainability of investment and sustainability of systems and sustainability of relationships and ways of working together are really important. I think there are some bits of learning actually, and I'm hoping one of my colleagues who's more technically adept than me can pop in the chat just a few links to some of the learning reports, because actually some of the stuff we've done, and actually Yvonne might talk about this a bit as well, as the learning from how we've done some of this and sharing some of that and trying to think about how you can embed that for the long term. We've got some reports from the London Community Response experience that someone can pop in the chat, but the bringing together of that learning and using as a platform for change. I think we also saw that through the Festival of Learning we had, and again, calling on a colleague to pop that in the chat, because there's a report that brings together a lot of that as a platform, and we're using some of that to help shape the discussions and the questions that we're talking about today, to think about how we use that to then take it to the next level, rather than, as you say, go back and then rebuild from there. How do we build from where we are now, and how do we build that progressive and more sustainable culture across sectors and across our different organisations? Because we do all ultimately want the same thing. We want London's communities to thrive. So how can we collectively build that understanding between ourselves that we need to for the future? And it was a beautiful segue, Kayla. You might not know, into the question that I'm going to ask the other three about where we go from here, because I think the last year has seen many funders being more flexible, actively trying to reach out, as you say, to disadvantaged communities, involving organisations in developing funding programmes. And Manny, I might come to you first with this one, but just thinking about that work over the last 18 months, has that helped to shift some of the power dynamics in the funding sector? If so, how do you think that's happened, and where do you think we need to go further?
Yeah, I think the thing that's probably had the most impact has been Black Lives Matter, and the sort of the pressure that comes around that to funders to really account for where the money is from and where their money is going. I think probably more so than COVID. I have more hope that the learning of that will be taken forward than I necessarily the sort of collaborative working around COVID, but that's all that bit is in our gift, James, to work on. I think there's 2 points around the sort of the shifting power dynamic. One is who makes the decision, where the decision sits around funding, but I actually think more importantly is what is the quality of decision making. And we can sometimes get really focused on who makes the decision, and actually it probably isn't the most, well, it isn't the most important part. And I say this because I think when I reflect on some of these questions around power, they're questions that the foundation sector may be sort of rediscovering or fairly new to, but they've been inherent in conversations in anything to do with democratic or civic participation for decades, if not centuries. So we aren't coming at this question of power new. We should really learn from what community organisers and community workers have been doing in their practice. But I think on where the decision sits, I think what's really interesting is for funders to really now reflect about where does that genuinely sit? Because on paper in your governance, it might be your trustees, but is that really where the decision is being made? And I think actually probably not most of the time. I think for us, trustees will generally go with the recommendation of the funding officer, the grant manager, or whatever the job title is in different foundations. And I think it's really important to recognise where is the real decision being made, because that then helps you to sort of think about how your processes and systems can be designed around actually where the real decision is. But as I said, I think the really important bit is about the quality of decision making, because you could handle your decision making over to a panel of sort of community members. That doesn't necessarily mean the decisions are going to be made any better. Really, we have to really focus on the quality. So I kind of divide this into three categories in my head. One is there are going to be decisions around funding where what the organisations want is a quick, transparent decision around funding so they can get on with business. And I think sometimes that's better left with sort of staff, well-trained, properly experienced staff who can make that decision quickly, not place a huge burden on the applicant, and just get on with things. The second is when you don't have any other expertise in your organisation, then it's really important to think about tools like participatory grant making, or how you can get together local communities or local organisations to be in charge of the design and the decision sort of around funding. And then again, the real focus has to be on how you properly support them. You can't expect people just to come to the table, especially when it's about residents. You can't expect them to just come to the table and suddenly be able to drop their own sort of the things that they've been working on in their last sort of in their role as residents and think about the whole. You have to support them to think about the whole and then come to sort of good collective decision making. And there are going to be times when your trustees there are going to be times when your trustees do need to make decisions around funding when it's very high risk, or when the volume of money is of such a sort of level that it really isn't sort of material to your organisation. So I would say, yeah, focus on not just where the decision is, but the quality of decision making across whoever is making it.
Fantastic, thank you, Manny. And I think also that point about the multitude of decisions that get made within that journey is the design process as well as the final decision making point, and actually recognising that power is in different places at different times depending on how the system is designed and how the process is designed. And Natasha, I might come to you with this one actually, because I think you may well build on some of the themes that Manny was exploring there.
Yeah, when I think about how I've seen power shift in the last 18 months, if I'm really honest, I can't think of many times when I've felt that, because we are a participatory funder, so we recruit and support panels of community members to make decisions. And actually, I don't think I've seen other funders trusting those community panels at a higher rate than they did 18 months previously. There's still a lot of, well, can they make a decision, but then could it come back to us and we'll sign it off? Sort of a conversations going on. So I'm not convinced we have got to that point. There's bits and bobs, you know, like you can do a bit less reporting and some nice things that look like a bit more trust, but I'm not sure when it's actually coming to it, there is loads more trust. And there's always going to be a power dynamic. It's not to say it shouldn't be tackled, but as Yvonne's like pointed out already, there's centuries of a power dynamic of things sitting differently between people, institutions, countries that have more money than others, and sort of that's 18 months of some looser reporting frameworks doesn't wash away that power dynamic that sits between people. And I think, I mean, I obviously believe participatory grant making is a really useful tool in shifting power, and I completely agree with Manny's sentiment that it needs to be done well and people need to be properly supported in trusted environments, and it needs to not be ever a funder or government or anyone else saying, there you go, there's the money, you sort it out. It does need to be a partnership between the funder and a community to have a joint responsibility and a joint action where a funder is sort of providing the resources for someone else's expertise. Sorry, I'm stealing all of your good words today, Yvonne. But to provide someone else's expertise to be central in decision making. You're there as their secretary almost to sort them out. You're there as their backer, but not saying, here you go, have a load of money and now it's your problem. It needs to feel the opposite of that. And I think there's something kind of a really important thing that is a big shift for us as funders to think about is how we sort of behave as a profession and how we welcome people in order to make this a trusted and safe and good place for people to work and for grantees and communities to feel that we're approachable, and to think about when we sit behind big glass shiny buildings, and to think about when we over intellectualize the work that we're doing and put it into diagrams and make it all seem very clever and unapproachable and fill it with jargon and words. We're just moving money around. It's not quite as clever as sometimes I think we make it out to be. And then we become a very intimidating environment for people to be in. And that is really counterintuitive to good decisions being made in different places, like Manny's saying, because we're a bit sort of stuffy with how we're behaving all the time. So I think that is a really like simple thing we can do, is just really think about the culture of our organisations and how that appears to other people. And also, sorry, I'm full run now, something I don't fully have an answer to, or don't have an answer to at all, is I think I've thought a lot over the last 18 months of how funders are a place that people can work that have experienced the issue that we're addressing, but it not being something that is like hugely traumatic to bring to work. How we make this a place where that we have that experience at all levels of our work, at a trustee panel and staff panels. Sorry, not staff panels, but staff groups, but without it being extractive. And I think that's something that the sector isn't showing good leadership on all the time.
Thank you, Natasha. You are always welcome to rant on the panel, especially when you do it so eloquently and cover so many points in such a short space of time. I appreciate it. And I think there are really important points there as well about the culture within organisations and the culture that we have as a sector as well. And I think there are really good examples of how that's challenged and changes over time. But sometimes there is that reversion back to previous ways of working as well. So it's how you build that journey. And Yvonne, maybe if I come to you on this question as well about how you've seen that power dynamic shift or not within the sector, and where we need to go further. As you say, having been involved and seeing some of the waves and some of the patterns over time, are there things that make you feel more positive that these things might sustain, or are there things where you think there's an opportunity here to go a lot further, a lot faster, or how does it look from where you sit?
So I think one of the things that's really important to acknowledge is the work that's taken place behind the scenes by Black and brown activists over the last 18 months to actually help shift some of the power, the conversations even about power, let alone some of the responses to the power dynamics within the funding sphere. Yes, we know Black Lives Matter really provided a a platform for that to be brought really to the fore. But I'm thinking about the work that Charities So White, Future Foundations and others did to kind of set a land to start a conversation, actually, in a really direct way. And, you know, as we know, when moments in time converge, that's when there's opportunities for systems to begin to shift. The other thing I wanted to just say was the whole issue of trust. Black and minoritized communities were not trusted. I'd like to see where we've shifted in that over the last 18 months. And I'm not just talking about trust in certain organizations. I'm talking about inherent trust in the system, in the sector that works with Black and brown communities. Because you can trust one or two organizations, you can fund them to the hilt, which is what happened prior to COVID. And then there was austerity and all that went. I'm talking about on a scale of 1 to 10, where were we prior to COVID and Black Lives Matter in terms of trust in the sector that I'm involved in? Where are we now? Where do we want to get to over the next 3 to 5 years? We only just secured our first 5-year funding last week. We didn't even have 3-year funding. We were project-based and mainly European project-based, actually. That's how we built in Valais prior to COVID. I think I also want to say in terms of power dynamics and trying to shift that longer term, we need to also acknowledge the role that Black and minoritized communities have actually played in relation to getting funding to communities that they serve and they know. And we need to build that part of the system. And and I've been asked so many times, and I really don't want to be asked the question again, what's the difference between the Phoenix Way and Baobab, for example? If you don't know, go and find out, okay? And the thing is, I wouldn't ask what's the difference between Trust for London and ESME or, another London-based fund. I wouldn't ask that, I'd go and find out. And if there's 400 odd organisations under ACF that are Foundation of Charitable Trust, if there are 2 or 3 that are Black-led, there needs to be many, many more than that going forward in order to begin, again, to kind of continue to shift the power balance going forward. I think there's so much space for that. And also in terms of things like initiatives like the Phoenix Way, it's not just about getting funding to groups, although that's very much part of the agenda. It's about trying to develop a real deep-rooted change in the funding system. So actually that those who know the sector, those that are leaders in the sector, those that know their communities are actually designing, developing, supporting, and facilitating change. They're developing leaders, they're supporting infrastructure. All those things are a part of what the Phoenix Way is intending to do over the next 5 years. And I think if we can do that in other spheres, then actually that also begins to shift some of the dynamics. I think it does matter who's funding, and it also matters, as Manny says, about the quality of the funding decisions that are made. And I know that for some of my colleagues, some of them may have been maybe on your boards, may be involved in funding, but for a vast majority of people involved, we've had to learn fast, because it's actually been a world that we've actually been excluded from in terms of making decisions about funding. And sorry, the very last thing I'd say, the Busker paper provides many 9 calls to action. It sets out a roadmap. What we're going to be doing with some of the funding we received for 5 years for the very first time is to make sure that the voice of the sector is really holding to account the funders in the space over the longer term. We want to enter into dialogue with you in a really sort of planned and strategic way, because it can't just be you coming to us and asking us and being extractive towards us. We need to actually try and create a bit more of a level playing field for the dialogue, and therefore for sustained change over the next 3 to 5 years. That's our plan in relation to a contribution to this sector, along with the Phoenix Way and others. Obviously the London Funders work and so on we're doing will definitely continue as well.
Fantastic. Thank you, Yvonne. If that's your plan, based on having worked with you over this time, I'm fairly sure that plan will come to pass very effectively. So I'm really looking forward to working with you on some of that. I think, as you say, there are issues there where we're building on long-term issues about trust, long-term issues about relationships, but also long-term structural issues in the sector. I think when we had our first conversations about the London community response with the equity crew, we're calling on organisations, yourselves, Consortium, Women's Resource Centre, Inclusion London, who have a job to do already. There was a purpose, there was a social mission, there was a vision that you had for your organisations and your networks. and telling us how to do funding wasn't necessarily the priority. There was work, there was a job of work to do already, and actually sometimes that challenge of where is the infrastructure, where is the connection, where is the space that doesn't just overload organisations that already had work to do in the first place, and how we build from where we are to make sure that there is that investment, to make sure that there's that capacity as well, because it doesn't mean that just because you're coming to some meetings telling us about funding, what you were doing the day before doesn't need doing anymore. And it's how we build that in a more sustainable way. So thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And I think also really looking forward, as I say, to working with you on the plans that you have for the future. Kayla, can I maybe come to you, because I think we've talked about it a little bit there from the funding side, that the sort of power dynamics as we might see them sitting around some of those tables. But obviously it's been really good to get your perspective. Some of those challenges about things have changed, but do you think now, after those 18 months, that you can talk openly with funders when things are not going to plan, or talk to us about issues that you're struggling with? Have the dynamics shifted enough that you feel confident to have those conversations?
Yes and no, I think is the honest answer to that question. I think yes, in that we seem to be moving into a space where funders seems to be more of a partnership approach, and their heightened understanding of the challenges, and that actually, what we aim to achieve and what the plan is a plan, and many things will always come up along the way that might take us down a different road, and that actually sometimes it's not just challenges. Actually, in the way that you deliver, particularly for us as Sister System, we're a co-created model of support, and because we're still a small organization, we are able to be reactive to a certain extent. So we're able to listen to our beneficiaries. They're absolutely the heartbeat of what we do at Sister System. And for example, in reaction to Black Lives Matter and the public slaughter of George Floyd, we were able to work with our young women and write a program called Honour Thyself, and then we're able to secure funding for that program and have a very honest conversation with that funder about the importance and the need of that program, and work, and then cascade all of those conversations down to the young women that we work with, which is an incredibly empowering way of working for everybody, from the board, and our volunteers, etc. So I think that whilst conversations have been had in a more honest, open way, I think that going forward, until we see the reality of how those conversations are going to kind of, where they're going to go over the next 6 to 12 months, I'm not sure. I can only hope that, and I think that we're all sitting in that same space here, and it's why we're here today, of acknowledging that, this is in many ways such an incredibly important conversation to have, but it's also reflective of, kind of, for me, quite a sad situation, that we shouldn't be in this situation in the first place, right? So for me, am I completely confident that going forward, I would be able to continue to have those conversations with funders without it having an impact on our reputation, on repeat funding, etc., etc.? I'm not sure, but I would like to think that based on where we are now, and certainly with the kind of bigger funders that Sister System has been able to secure, we are having those conversations, and funders are listening, and they are working with me and with the team to make sure that we find solutions to some of those challenges, and that they kind of support us with their expertise, as opposed to kind of being, being in that position of power and us being completely answerable. It's become more of a partnership. How do we work this out together? How can we support you to work this out? What that's going to look like in the next 12 to 18 months, just simply because of how deep seated this issue is. I'm not sure it will be resolved that quickly. I think that the conversation it's a long and complex conversation that's going to involve people to have a certain amount of, to be able to be brave and honest about the situation that we're in and how we really affect really long-lasting change.
Fantastic, thanks, Akela. And I think, as you say, it's one of the challenges we face, and one of the challenges when we have these conversations, is trying to anticipate what the next 12 to 18 months have in store, and therefore how people need to react to them. So I think if we're thinking about it longer term, and I think this is where I'm going to start drawing on questions from the Q&A box. So colleagues on the call, if you have questions that you want to ask the panel, make sure you're popping them in that Q&A box, or voting for things up and down as we go. But I'm going to pick one that's number 2 on the list at the moment, such as my gift as some sort of low budget Radio 1 DJ. I'm going to go to number 2 in the hit parade, which is maybe sort of building a little bit, Akela, on your question. I might come to you first with it, actually, if that's okay, which is about the, and it's an anonymous attendee, which is why it's interesting in a power discussion, but you're obviously welcome to ask anonymous questions online, people. The question about, do we actually start calling out funders who don't fund well? Let's, for the sake of argument, say that the we in that is an organisation like London Funders. Let's depersonalise it and say is there an organisation that's got a responsibility to call out what might be seen as bad practice in funding that could be done through, as someone's mentioned on here, things like Grant Advisor, some of the surveys that Manny was talking on. Is there a need? Is there a space? Is there a requirement to actually be more open about calling out bad practice, either from organisations who are receiving it or through a more intermediary organisation like us, or Grant Advisor, or someone else? Akela, can I come to you first, just see how that feels to you?
Yeah, I think yes, in essence, absolutely. I think that, you know, we are all, whether as funders or as grant makers or as organisations meeting the need, we should all be held to account. We should all be acting in a way that's transparent, you know, and that we can, you know, have that open conversation. I think it's how it's done that is the thing to really be looked at. I think it needs to be done in a way in which is kind of empowering and moving us forward, and not a way that is punitive. So I think that it's how do we do that in a way in which supports the wider question, supports the wider kind of objectives that we all share around sustainability and equity. So it'd be interesting actually to see what kind of models we can come up with, working together and working in partnership and collaboration, about how we would do that in a way that's that moves us towards positive change, as opposed to kind of a way that keeps us focused on what the challenges are. So that would be my kind of initial response to that. Yeah.
No, thank you. That's helpful. I think there are challenges, I guess, in this question about calling out funders who don't fund well. What is well, and whose job is it to define that?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we would need to start, James, is what does that framework look like? What is well? Yeah. And ensuring that, you know, the people that are involved in creating that has got the right people are involved in that, and that all the voices across the sector are being heard to shape what that looks like. And what do you then do with what isn't going well, and how do we work together to kind of change that, and to yes, ultimately we should all be held accountable and responsible, and all kind of, you know, want and we do all want to do, you know, to put in place best practice and to put changes into place. I guess one of my major concerns is that we're not continuing just to focus on the challenges. We know what the challenges are, you know, for those, we've known this for many, many years. It's about what do we now do to ensure that we are eradicating some of these, and it's not an elastic band snap back and 12 months from now we're back in the same position that we were in prior to Black Lives Matter and COVID, that this can be long-lasting, sustaining change.
Thank you. I'm going to bring Yvonne in, and then Manny, I might ask you as well in terms of your process of accountability. I know you're going through this kind of discussion as well. But thanks to Kelly. Yvonne, you had your hands up there,
Yeah,
so can I come to you?
It was just a really short comment about calling funders out. I would suggest that funders have been called out in the past. They may not know that directly, but the conversations within the sector about experiences of racism towards groups by funders are conversations that are part of our narrative. Because when you experience something which is very, very hurtful and disregarding, those conversations happen, as you say. If you get bad service from an organization, 8 people get to know about it, or so that there's sort of some data about, you know, in terms of the ripple effects. So actually those conversations have been going on. There's now a conversation that's emerging about, is this for real? Is this short term? Is it flavor of the month? Is this systemic? You know, are we going to get the longer term change? And that's a conversation that I think we need to engage in now. And there is a need for some kind of matrix and data analysis that actually our sector does. It's not the sector doing it on us, not the funders doing it on us, it's us also doing it in relation to the funders, and sharing that information both within our sectors, but also with the funders. Say, hey, here's a mirror we want to hold up to you. What are you going to do about that? So I think that work needs to be done. We've not had the resources in terms of time, find funding, opportunities and space and so on to do that, but it feels like there's groups around that are beginning to kind of, you know, shape those conversations, and that needs to be part of the wider system going forward over the next 18 months, 3 to 5 years. We have to be part of that systems change process as well.
Thanks, Yvonne. I think that does highlight as well the importance of doing that kind of work in partnership, because I think although far more than 8 people know about my experiences with Virgin Media, other broadband providers are thankfully available. I have power in that relationship as a consumer. I can pick between, but it is a slightly different one to navigate when we're talking about money within the system. And money, you're obviously going through a process where you're looking at feedback and accountability and how that happens. How's that working from your point of view?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with what both Yvonne and Caleb just said. Essentially, these conversations are out there happening. It's a question as to how much you want to open your ears, really, and your eyes to them, and then sort of act upon that. And it's inevitable with social media. Grantee is a tool, but you know, it's coming through Twitter, it's coming through other means anyway. So it's sort of how you respond. What's interesting about our experience, where we have got had a small group of recent applicants who are giving in-depth anonymous feedback to an independent organisation, is that they'll tell us the positives, they'll tell us lots of the sort of negatives about our process, but what they say at the end of that is, look, we really want to be involved in helping you improve this. We really value the fact that you are listening to us, and how can we stay in touch about what you're doing, but also making sure that you continue to evolve and adapt. So once you've gone through the shock of getting feedback, actually, if you open yourself up to building your systems around having regular feedback, actually that's welcomed by the people who may have slightly negative or positive experience, but they want to kind of help you improve things. I think that's just human nature, really. So how we do that, how we involve it, how we make sure people's time is properly compensated is really, really important. But I think as a message for funders, it's going to come through the sort of antagonistic route. If you open yourself up to do it in a constructive, sort of collaborative way, and recognise people's experiences and expertise, then you'll have a much better experience and you'll get much better outcomes.
Fantastic, thank you, Manny. I'm going to call on another question from the Q&A box, and Natasha, I'm going to pick on you to kick us off with this one, if that's okay, which is from Sarah, who obviously, and I will say to all of you, congratulates you all on the excellent conversation we're having so far. So thank you, Sarah, and thank you everyone for that conversation. The question though is looking about the barriers to encouraging and enabling grant makers to change those funding relationships. And there are sort of breaks to change that might exist within the system. Sometimes people will put up a barrier of a trustee, an auditor, a lawyer, someone who's a bit more risk averse within that system. The question is about what do you as panelists think grant making staff can or should do to help ameliorate some of those concerns, or encourage that trust and overcome some of those barriers or breaks in the system. Natasha, your thoughts?
I say all of this with the caveat of that I don't think that Camden Giving has 100% a equal relationship with the organisations we give grants to, and it's and we also don't give grants to organisations that apply to us on a very regular basis. So it's not by any means a perfect mechanism. And I certainly, as the director of county giving, experience a lot of times when it's not really believed that a community panel is making decisions at county giving, and they absolutely are, and we absolutely are militant on not trying to influence those decisions as well. But I think we carry forward with us centuries of an assumption that that is not really happening. But I do think there's a lot to be done in the tone of how you work with people. And actually, I'll say like bravo to Paul Hamlin Foundation, who quite early on in COVID, and they fund some of the work that we do with young community panels, phoned us and said, don't tell us what you're telling other funders, tell us what you really need. And if you don't need it right now, know that we can come back you can come back to us at a later point and tell us when you do need it. And I don't think anyone's like, I can't think of another time a funder's been that open with us, and that completely changed the dialogue of how we talk to Paul Hamlin. And I think that sort of really being the fully vulnerable funder and saying we're available and we're with you on this. I think just repeatedly saying that is super helpful, but also being really open. Like, if you can have an office that people can come into without having booked, if you can have people back to this point of not being over professionalized, if you can have, if you're funding lots of organizations that, I don't know, work in the homelessness sector, and there's lots of young people in that sector and they're all in jeans, and I don't know, don't you therefore be the funder that looks and feels the opposite to that, because you do need to be not across the board, but there needs to be some, we're in this together, and that comes from the tone of how people operate. If your grantees are wearing jeans, then maybe you should put your jeans on as well. That's not going to solve everything, but some sort of being a bit less formal and a bit more honest and admitting your own flaws. And just in the last sort of few weeks of looking at the Afghan refugee crisis, it's really helped to open up conversations to phone up and say, we as Camden Giving don't fully understand this. Can you, as our grantees, help us understand what you know? You educate us. We trust that you have more knowledge than we do, and we'll take that with us, and we'll work in a way that suits you. So I think just better dialogue and better conversation, and more humanness in the way you work.
Thanks, Natasha. We're big fans of taking a more human approach to things. I think there's a few sort of learning blogs that people contributed on the London Funders website on that theme as well, because I think it is an important point that we've, especially over the last 18 months, we've all seen into each other's houses. We've become a bit more human as people, rather than we're doing this job and we're going to engage in this more professional way. And I think that greater connectedness has brought some difference in the way that we think and work. Manny, I'm wondering if I can come to you on that theme about, you talked about where decision making sits within a system, and obviously there are elements of which, as the grant making staff, there's a greater engagement sometimes with the groups or with the issues that are being talked about. How can that translate into also influencing others who are within that decision making journey or that design journey, who might have less appetite for risk or less enthusiasm for some of the ideas that are being presented from community groups?
I mean, one of the first things to make sure is that your staff broadly reflect the communities that they're working with, because if they do, then they will know how to represent the views and the work that those communities want to do in a way which is honest and understanding. Really, if I come from an Indian community, if I go and work with an Indian community group, I'm going to know it a lot better than if someone who doesn't, and I can understand what they're doing. I can challenge a little bit as well, and I can try and work constructively with them to get through any challenges they may have, and I can then come back and provide a report to whoever is making the decision about what I've found and about what I want to do. I think that's probably the instinctive answer I have, really, is make sure your staff, even if they don't come from those communities, have significant experience of working in those communities outside of a funding arena. Understand how they really work and how they intersect with public institutions and other organizations that have power, so they can really get beneath the skin. There is something about your mentality when you go, if someone applies to you for funding and you're essentially going to go and decide whether you're going to fund them, there's something about your demeanor and your approach, and the demeanor has to be one of, I want you to have this funding because I need you to work for my funding strategy and my outcomes to be delivered. How can I help you through this process in a way which gives you the best possible chance? of getting funding, rather than sometimes what has happened. I've been in a few of these where it's like, well, tell me why you deserve this money. And it's the subtle things like that, the sort of intangible and sometimes more tangible aspects of that whole process, which are super important. But your staff having some form of experience outside of the funding world is super important.
Thank you. A really, really important point. So also that point about how funders need civil society groups and communities to deliver, because that money is sat there to achieve social change and positive change. It can only do that through working effectively with people. So how we bring that to life through those discussions is really important. I'm going to pick one of the other questions, and Yvonne, I might come to you first with this one, if that's okay, which is about the role of funders using their voice or influence as well as the money to bring about change, and whether there are helpful ways that can be done, if there are the right sort of spaces where the power dynamic that does exist can be better used. And I know from having worked in the sector where I would battle to get into certain rooms to be able to have certain conversations, now that I've got the word funder in my title, I can go to any round table I want to and give my views about almost any subject. And I don't know any more than I did when I was back in different organisations, but we still have opportunities to use voice and influence. Is that helpful? Can that change be done well, and how can we navigate some of the power dynamics that are inherent in that approach? No small question, Yvonne, but what are your thoughts?
I mean, I suppose one example of one of the things that we've been involved in over a couple of months ago, which hopefully will continue to unfold. We were asked, along with a couple of colleagues, to come and meet with funders who are members of the Woburn Place Collaborative, so some of the more progressive funders. And I'd never heard of this group before. As I said, this is all really new territory for me and for Ubele. But what we were able to do was actually say to those funders, actually, rather than we come and tell you our story, you come and tell us your story around anti-racist work that you fund, how you've tried to fund in more equitable ways, what some of the challenges are. And let's get into a conversation about that. Now, I mean, it was interesting because 3 funders actually, agreed to do that process of sharing, not just with us, but with their colleagues in order to influence the wider system. That was sort of, in a way, that was funders using their voice, because obviously if there's 15 to 20 funders in that network, similarly with the equalities network of funders that again, I didn't know anything about until last year, existing, there are spaces for those conversations that have been developed. As to whether they are more than a talking shop is a question that I'm still left with. I don't know, because I'm not party to those networks, but I think there need to be, in a way, there needs to be a coalition of the brave, because I think funders are often quite conservative, even those at the more radical end of the spectrum, and those who are involved in funding social justice initiatives specifically. But I think that, again, in terms of timing, the time is right for those kinds of more kind of hard-edged initiatives to be developed, because there is the need, in a sense, well, you are each other's peers, people want to follow what seems to be best practice. People want to follow leaders, people want to lead, and funders want to lead. So I think that there is a space and opportunity now for that to happen, to build on some of the work that was happening before, but to take it to another level. I think the work with the London funders around the response has been great, because not only has it been actually funders working together and trying to change the system, but also they've actually listened to we've been in conversation dialogue with yourselves over the last 18 months. And actually, as Akela says, there've been changes in things, looking at application forms. Sounds very simple, but being asked questions that you've never been asked before, and then using that to look at the data, what the impact has been, and then going back to the system and changing it again if it still feels that there's more, if we still feel there's more stretch that's needed in it and change that's needed in it. I think that kind of, peer support, challenge, learning is really important, because actually you're talking to each other. You're the same tribe. And therefore, it feels like there's an opportunity to kind of take it one step further, to influence each other going forward. I'd be hopeful that I know there are brave people within that system. There are brave Black and brown people. Some of them, many of them I'm meeting for the first time. I'm like, wow, you're in philanthropy. That's brilliant. What are the battles that you're fighting? Who are you networking with? Where do you get your support? And I also know there's white allies. So for me, it's like actually a coalition of those people to really try and influence things as we go forward.
Fantastic. Thank you, Yvonne. Natasha, I might ask you a similar version of that question. So you were talking about how, bringing residents and groups in changes the dynamic in relationship, be that with the council or the private sector or, different sectors working together. How far can funders go in using that voice and influence to bring about change when you are working in place as well and tackling some of those challenges?
Well, I'll tell you some sort of things that community panels have said to me recently that's really sort of helping shape how I feel. Because I've sort of going thinking, well, I'm a funder, I'll do what all the other funders do. We'll get money to community projects and crack on. But actually, it's been really interesting. We were doing some work on poverty recently, and the community panel have sort of said, well, this is great, like we'll crack on and we'll make sure that we spend these grants really well and in a considered way. This is absolute nonsense that we even have to, in Camden, a place of such incredible wealth. It's nonsense that we're having to do this work. There's got to be bigger stuff, and actually they as a group really want to campaign, and I'm not entirely sure how we'll do it yet, but I think that we have a responsibility to support them to do that and to make their voice heard, because as you say, James, like people will open a door and people with funder in their title can walk in, and we've got a responsibility to bring in our community panels who aren't quite in that same situation all the time and make their voice heard in that room. My immediate feeling, like right now as I'm working out how we do that, is I feel a bit sweaty about it. I don't know how to do campaigning, and I'm like, oh goodness. So I don't know how to do it properly, but I think we have to be significantly braver and acknowledge that needs to happen, and we have to do more things that make us feel a bit sweaty as funders in order to not get back to a situation where we're all pretending we're shocked that when a crisis happens, some people are disproportionately impacted. We've got to do a lot more of those brave things, and just the moving of money is clearly not sufficient in terms of the power we could have. So yes, I think we should be doing some campaigning, but how we do it and how we make sure we do it in a way that it's not. It's the voice of the people that we are working with is being heard, not just the voice of the people that work for a foundation being heard.
That's it. Thanks, Natasha. And Manny, if I could ask you the same question, because obviously Trust for London have an approach to trying to tackle issues in a systemic way and trying to bring about influence as well through your money and through the work that you do. How does that sit with you?
I mean, it's Natasha's last comment there about, it's our responsibility to essentially give platforms of power to others. It's probably where I sit most naturally. I'll give you some examples. So we fund lots of research and policy work, and we funded a few sort of commissions, when you get together the great and the good to talk about a particular issue and sort of release some findings. Actually, what we've been able to do in recent years is say, actually, instead of alongside us or instead of us on that commission, put an organisation with funding on that commission, or an expert by experience that we've been working with who really knows a topic, put that person on your commission. I'm much more inclined to want to do that than for us to be the focal point. We should be using our funding to empower others to be able to have a voice and make change, rather than to sort of empower our own voices. There may be times when it is useful for us to have a say, particularly in the sort of behind the scenes, inside a sort of network-led kind of change at a London level. But really, we want to be giving others that platform.
Thank you. I'm going to ask my panelists one last question, if I may, and give you about a minute each to answer, which is a question that was asked, and I clicked the wrong button, so you might not be able to see it on your screen because I've moved it to the wrong box. But there's been, someone's asked, there's been a few reflections on how this style of working, these sort of different approaches to power and participation aren't necessarily new to the COVID-19 pandemic. We've seen previous crises, we've seen previous iterations of changes to the way that we work. The question is asking if any of the panelists have reflections on why we seem to revert back to the old ways of working, and where the opportunities lie that help us avoid reverting this time round. Sasha and Yvonne have both got their hands over their mouths, so I'm going to go to Manny first, because he wasn't quick enough to suggest you were silent on that one. But how do we avoid reverting back to old ways of working? How do we use some opportunities to build more progressive change this time around? Manny?
That was the first question that came up, and it's a really good question. I haven't been able to answer it in the hour since it came up in my head. Institutions like ours have tremendous muscle memory. You know, the crisis is in a box. You deal with the crisis in the box, but really the crisis is just stopping you doing the thing you were trying to do beforehand. So when it's over, your muscle memory kicks in and you go back to the usual way. It's not just us, it's all kinds of institutions, and it's human beings. You can see now in how the pandemic is playing out. People are just getting back to what they perceive to be life as normal without necessarily major changes happening. And I think that's really, really, really tricky. It requires us as the sort of the leaders of these organizations to step back and say, okay, what are we really learned? And then ask the really important question, which is, why are we doing things the way we're doing things? And what is the best way to do it? And I can't think of a better answer than that, really. It's you have to really step back and say, okay, this is a moment. We're asking the world to change because of this moment. How are we going to change sort of in this moment?
Excellent, thank you. Yvonne, how do we build on this rather than reverting back?
Yeah, I've been reflecting on this because I'm aware that in terms of community-based practice, for example, we've had many decades of that, of community interventions with Black and minoritized communities, for example, or with women's groups or with youth groups. And I'm of an age now where I think all that work and all that knowledge and all that expertise that was built up seemed to have kind of got lost in terms of thinking about, what do we learn from there? What might we take forward? What might we take going forward into this brave new world that we're created, linked with what's appropriate for the 21st century? So I've been kind of sitting with that conundrum for quite a while. And Ubele is an intergenerational organisation set up by the elders, but increasingly bringing in a younger generation of change agents and social activists and community facilitators. And so I think there needs to be space whereby we can capture, as Manny says, the learning from this period in time. And that's not just for the funders. I think it's in community-based organizations. I think it's other parts of the system. And to create, capturing that learning, lessons from it, models from it, and kind of say, actually, these are things we're going to build on, to be quite intentionally and quite strategic about it, because otherwise we'll end up doing what we've already done, which is, we lose people from the system for all sorts of reasons, and that sort of knowledge of how to do things kind of get lost. And I'm always sort of thinking about how Ubele might do that with others, because actually I'm also aware with some of the younger activists involved in the field, they're drawing their knowledge a lot from American systems. I'm not saying they're not helpful, but actually there's a way of doing things here that actually we've got some of that intelligence and knowledge already created, and we're creating now. So I think that we have to be really intentional about capturing it, harnessing it, learning from it, and also implementing the best practice from it to go forward. Otherwise, we'll just keep going around the same sort of track, really, of losing it all and starting from scratch. We don't have time, we don't have the resources. It seems a real waste of intention and activity. We've got to do it different this time around.
That's it. Thank you, Yvonne. And Natasha, your thoughts?
I agree with Manny that there's a sort of muscle memory and we fall back into it very easily. And I think one of the reasons we're falling back into it quickly is people are exhausted. There's a real, I feel like every session I join and every meeting I ever join, someone tells me how tired they are and how they've got 18 months worth of admin backlog to get through. And I think there's an exhaustion, and the more exhausted we are, the more likely we are to fall into muscle memory. So I don't know how practical this is, but I think the funding sector needs a little bit of a rest. And I say that knowing that Akela can probably hear me and is being dragged into things, and she's had to step away, and that our grantees are wildly busy as well. But I think funders need to change more than our grantees do as general. Therefore, we need to take a bit of a step back and have the energy to make that change a little bit as well. And bringing people that don't work in funding to come and think that what we're doing is sometimes a bit crazy, and that to come and sort of look with fresh eyes, bring in people, be it through participatory grant making or some other process, that come in and say, isn't it a bit weird that we're giving all these grants about poverty but we're not campaigning in it? or, you know, our young grant makers cannot believe that other funders don't have participatory grant making for young people's grants. They think it's hilarious, to be honest, that isn't happening in other places. You need to bring in other people that see what we're doing with fresh eyes on a repeated basis in order to keep changing, and not just keep the good things for the last 18 months, but make sure there's more good things every 18 months going forward.
Thank you, Natasha. As you say, Akola has had to step away because running a micro organisation, being on a panel and dealing with issues in the office do mean that occasionally not all of those things can happen simultaneously, even if someone as fantastic as she. So we're very grateful to her for being with us as well. Thank you to the panel for those reflections. I'm not going to ask you any more questions. I think you've nailed power and participation. You've given us some clear ambition and some hope for the future, which is what we're hoping to do through these conversations. And as Natasha says, to try and capture some of the opportunity, some of the energy, some of that hope that we're talking about for the future as well. So we'll certainly be sharing some of the key resources from this with everybody. We'll also be sharing out links to learning from this event and the other reports as well that have been referenced with people. So if you were in a room, there would be thunderous applause from our people in the audience. Sadly, you'll just have to imagine everybody sat in their living rooms at the moment, clapping like mad. But it's been a privilege to be on the panel with you four and to hear from you. Very grateful for your time. And we're going to use the last sort of 2 minutes to do it as a segue from the wonderful world of virtual events, where you do get to hear from these fantastic panels, to the world of in-person, in real life, with biscuits. Actually, I don't know if I might be over-promising. I don't know if we've got biscuits, but real life events. So we're going to start building on some of these conversations through our network groups. I'm delighted that 2 of our network group chairs are joining us to give little teasers of what's to come in next week's sessions, where we have the in-rooms part of the conference. And Ollie, I'm going to come to you first, if I can, just to give us a heads up about what's going to be happening at the Research and Evaluation Group.
Thanks, James. Yeah, I've popped up on your screen just to give a bit of a plug for the London Funders Research and Evaluation Network, which restarts again next Tuesday at 2 p.m. in person, as James was saying. So I'm the new chair. I'm taking the baton from Nick Wilsden. I'm an evaluation manager for Imperial Health Charity, but the group's not just for evaluation people like myself, but open for anyone with an interest in getting more learning insights from our data. So next week's event works well as a follow-up to this session, focusing on how we go about collecting data connected to diversity, equity, and inclusion in our application forms, our grant stats, our surveys, for example, just like Manny and the other panelists were talking about at the start of the session. We've got the amazing Bonnie, who's the director of the Social Investment Consultancy and a 360 Giving trustee, joining us. Will be our guest speaker. The event's now full, I believe, but you can join the waiting list. You can ask London Funders to add you to mailing alerts for future sessions. Get in touch also if you'd want to be a future speaker about anything interesting you're doing. We'll be covering lots of interesting and practical topics over the next year. Yeah, so that's it from me. I'm really pleased to join the London Funders family.
We're very pleased to have you in the family, Ollie, and thank you for your first meeting being a sellout already. I mean, that's incredible. We're very excited about having that next week. So thank you for joining us and giving us a snapshot of what's to come next week. We also have the fantastic Gemma, who's going to talk to us about the Children and Young People Network, also happening next week. Gemma.
Hi everyone, and thanks panelists. That was so interesting. I was definitely nodding a lot and saying yes to so many of your points. And next week, yes, I'm going to be chairing the Children and Young People's Funders Group in person. I will make sure there are biscuits, and we're going to be focusing on how immigration issues are affecting children and young people in London, thinking about what funders can do to support children and young people who are growing up with insecure immigration status. We know that there's over 300,000 young people in the UK who face challenges to regularising their immigration status, which actually, if you think about that, 300,000 young people with insecure immigration status is pretty sobering. We're going to be joined by an amazing speaker, Chris-Anne Jarrett, who is the CEO and founder of We Belong, which is a migrant-led, youth-led organisation fighting for the rights of young migrants to be treated fairly. We're also going to have Anita Hurrell, who's head of the Migrant Children Project at Coram Children's Legal Centre, who's going to be talking to us about how the EU settlement scheme is impacting on young people in the capital. And Geraldine Blake from London Funders is going to be talking about the new London Funders immigration advice strategy. So looking forward to learning from our speakers, from each other, and to committing to do things differently to support young people in this situation in London.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Gemma. And really good to have that network meeting again, particularly at the moment on such an important issue. And I think Milena has popped in the chat details or her email. So if you want to sign up either for the waitlist or for network groups next week, do drop Milena a line. I feel like we've massively promised on the biscuits now, and given that we haven't had in-person events for a year and our events budget is sat there not being spent, I might even stretch to a milk chocolate hobnob and a Jaffa cake. You never know. So please do come along to the network groups next week. We're looking forward to seeing you there. We're also looking forward to seeing you over the next couple of days at the conference online. You've got sessions coming up tomorrow and Wednesday morning. It's on the same link that we've already sent to you, so we look forward to seeing you on those. But for now, thank you so much to the panel. Thank you to the chairs for joining us for those teaser sessions. Thank you to all of you for joining us. Do tweet and check out the other tweets using the Conference21 hashtag on Twitter. And we look forward to seeing you again tomorrow morning. Bye for now.